So sometimes I have I usually have a story. But sometimes I have a story that I just feel I need to tell and I don't yet know why. So hopefully by the end of the story we'll all figure it out. This story begins, when does all good stories begin? A long time ago in a land? Okay, very good. And this was in northern India, in Dharamsala. And I had been traveling already for more than a few months. And I was on a wild adventure around the world, seeking to experience practice in different places. And I was fortunate to end up in a little Aboriginal community outside Uluru, Ayers Rock, Australia, in a little Maori community in New Zealand called Nukumaru, even in a temple district around not far from Hong Kong. But at this point in the journey, I was in northern India, and I just arrived into an area called McLeod-Ganj, which is sort of the upper region of Dharamsala. And this place is kind of famous because the Dalai Lama makes his home there. And that's where his home temple is, and that's where he moved in exile from Tibet. And so I figured there'd definitely be something to get into in Dharamsala. And I remember the first day I arrived, I found myself in a little cafe, the Rangzen Cafe, which means freedom in Tibetan. And I was, getting whatever it was I was restoring myself with after a grueling bus ride that, nearly killed me. And I couldn't help but overhearing this American, I'm Canadian if you don't know, this American boy talking about how excited he was to be going to see the Dalai Lama tomorrow. And I was kind of trying to peacefully eat my dumplings or whatever without feeling a lot of judgment or jealousy. But why would come on, look at this guy. He's got a Grateful Dead shirt and shaved his head to look spiritual, but I don't believe any of it. I've been doing this all my life, and he breathing deeply, and then he, I suppose, sensing my interest, says, "Are you going?" And I'm, "No." And he said, "Well, you can go. Anyone can go." "What?" Yes. He's meeting any foreign travelers that want to meet him. You just have to go down to the monastery and take your passport, and it's tomorrow morning at 6 in the morning or something, but maybe if you go early, you can get on the list. Who knew there was a list? So I did. I went long before the sun rose, and I remember going through the town and spinning the prayer wheels and heading down the rocky path, and there I was at the gate to the temple. And it was closed. It was locked. In fact, every entrance I could possibly imagine was locked. And I thought, well, lucky for him, my new American friend. And so I thought, what else can I do? So I sort of wandered around and still nothing doing, and I figured, well, I can have a spiritual practice without the Dalai Lama. I don't need him to be spiritual, damn it. And so I found a little trail leading around the full exterior of the monastery, and I began to walk and pray and meditate. Some of you know this story. It's in Return to the Sacred, but I've never told it live. And as I was praying and walking and meditating, I noticed Tibetans on the same path, and I was touched. and then disturbed because they were all going the other direction. Like very systematically, very intentionally. They had malas. They were clearly knowing what they were doing. I was going against the flow, the only white guy on the spiritual path backwards. So this is totally true. So I kind of like at a certain point, priding myself on being an expert in world religions and spirit. So I sort of kind of went over to the side and stretched. And then when no one was looking, I sat down on a bench so that I could then join the flow. Like I knew what I was doing, And when I sat down, this very old monk came and sat down beside me. And he shook his head, like, I've been doing it all day. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a doozy, that last part there. So he asked me in very broken English where I was from. And I answered, and he looked at me long and hard. And then he said, do you know Brad Pitt? I'm serious. And I was like, no. I mean, I know of him. And he smiled and he was like, I do. And I was like, I can't win this morning. So he kind of explains that they had just finished filming 7 Years in Tibet, somewhere near there, and he got to be an extra in the film. And then he continued to stare at me, and I continued to feel awkward. And then he said something like, it was like an uncharacteristic question for a Tibetan, but he asked me something like, what do I do? Like, what do I do? It was really something like that. What do I do? Like back home. And I said, well, actually, I'm kind of like a spiritual guy. And I walk on paths backwards and, Anyway, I don't know how I described it, but I said, I work with people and I help people. And he nodded kind of like knowingly. And then he was like, yeah, like right, I knew that. And then he was like, come with me. And I was like, okay. So he scurried up the path and I followed him. And then we got to the monastery where it was still all locked up and there was a little crowd forming, people, tourists, or whatever it was, travelers coming to pay their respect to the Dalai Lama. And he took me in through this secret side door. And then we went down this long corridor of these tiny little cells where the monks lived. And he took me to his quarters, a tiny room, much smaller than this carpet, where he lived. And I noticed on the way to the monks' quarters, any monk that saw him backed off and bowed with great respect. And I was like, not knowing what was going on. And so he brought me in and he offered me yak butter tea. Did you ever see that in the movies? Anyone ever try that? Yeah, it's disgusting. I mean, by my standards, it's enriching and delightful if you're Tibetan. I'm not going to describe what it tastes like, but it was a generous offering, and I made my way through it. And then he gave me a scarf of blessing, and he said, you must give this to him so he can give it to you. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, would you like to meet the Dalai Lama? And I was like, yes. He said, did you bring your passport? And I was like, yes. And so sure enough, this is a very long story that I don't want to take all day for, but sure enough, after some time, he knew what was going on and people came to his door to get him. He turned out to be a very high teacher in the temple. And we just kind of headed right over to the line as they were preparing the greetings, kind of gave my passport to the security man and just pointed at the list and was just like, he's on the list now. And I did get to have a very brief moment to meet and offer a blessing to and receive a blessing from the Dalai Lama. And after that, my new friend was waiting for me still and called me back to his quarters, where he insisted that every day I would have to return for prayers and meditation in the morning, and then afterwards I could come see him. And I didn't realize at the time, but prayers were like 5 o'clock in the morning, like something ridiculous. And they went on for hours. And that's what I did for a month. Every morning I would wake up, I would rub my disbelieving eyes and shake my confused head, and I would go down that trail and I'd go in the secret door, and then I would sit there in my little white, Indian linens, surrounded by all these Tibetan monks. And I was put with the young Tibetan monks kind of in the back. And there was a prayer book in Tibetan, which I didn't understand at all. I had it upside. It was like out of the movies. The first time I was like, ma, ma, ma. And they were like, no, it's... And so I hummed along, and I noticed something kind of funny and interesting, which was that not only was this a place of great energy and reverence and power, but everyone around me was still very human. And the young monks would sometimes look at their watches or elbow each other or, things like that. And when there was a pause, sometimes this one monk in particular would lean over and then he'd say a word in English to me like yellow. And he'd point at the cover. And I'd be like, yeah, yellow, very good. And then he'd teach me the Tibetan, and we'd go back and forth. Eventually, it came so that he always saved a seat for me, and I always sat beside him. And what I want to say is that the practice was profound in many ways, of course. There was this great resonance in the room. The words, the tones, the meaning didn't even matter because the vibration was so clear and strong, so carried by the community itself. And I found myself floating on it day after day. And sitting there with the intention to be still, with the intention to let the drone of the mantras and the instruments silence my mind, did certainly begin to silence my mind, so that with each returning trip, the process happened quicker and quicker and quicker. And there were still, challenges like leg cramps and moments of confusion on special days where everyone did everything differently and I had no idea what was going on. I was the only one standing when they were sitting and the only one sitting when they were standing, that kind of stuff. But when it came time for me to go, I said to the young man, I was sort of like trying to indicate, like, me, no more, And he insisted that I wait. He was like, wait, something like that. So when it was over, he came to the room of the senior monk with me. And the senior monk translated and he says, before you go, he wants you to meet his family and have dinner with them. So a few days later, this is the end of my time there, I found him in the square, and he took me to this very, 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 very tiny little home, and to this couple who I found out through translation was not his blood family. His blood family, for all he knew, had been killed in Tibet, and that he was one of many refugees who fled through the mountains and found sanctuary in northern India, in Dharamsala. But these people had accepted him as their son, and he had accepted them as their family. And he recognized me as his brother, as I did him. And he wanted me to know that I would always have that home in his heart wherever I went. And he gave me a little writing as well. He wrote me a letter that I later got translated in once I was in Canada from a Tibetan expert. And the interesting thing about it was that he actually gave me a little advice. And he said something about how the attainment of enlightenment was close at hand, and how the three jewels remained within me, and that I would remember them soon. And certain other sort of, curious references and culturally specific terms. But the sort of promise was clear. And then what it said in closing, though, was, as long as you surround yourself with family, your heart will remember, and you will know what to do. That was it. And I share that with you today because we have this joint topic of community and spiritual practice. And what I realized is something very extraordinary about the nature of community, which is that true spiritual practice shines when held in community, and that community itself is a practice. And that's very much what we're doing here. We're remembering community, remembering. And one by one, people say, I remember. I remember. I remember that we are all family. I remember that we are more connected than I will ever understand. We are all expressions of the one. And in that remembering, I will return to remind you. And when you forget who you are, I will remind you. And when you feel lost, I will call you. I will check on you. And I will remind you to return to who you are. And we will walk this path together. Because on the human dimension, what else is there? I mean, what else is there? We live in a world of seeming and being and becoming and possession and roles and titles, but in the end, all of it is shaped by what's going on inside. And we shape what's going on inside through our practices. Whatever it may be, meditation, prayer, affirmations, yoga, could be running, could be gardening, could be Bible study, could be sweat lodges. But the practices that cultivate the soul, that refine the mind, open the heart, and ultimately return us to the living experience of our interconnection, our interdependence, the remembering of our place in spirit. And so that is what a membership day is about. It's about individuals reigniting that relationship to spirit in a way that is witnessed and affirmed by others and returned as an act of love and service to the world. So I'm going to ask my brother Stephen to come up, and we are going to prepare to welcome our new members. And rather than talk more about what it means to live it and to feel it, to bless them each from wherever we sit for their journey, whatever it is they are reclaiming and restoring and naming today. I would like to also call up our board president, Judith Witten, and our board vice president, Catherine McKay, and they're going to help to hand out some of our goodies. So, if you forget, let me remind you. We will begin to set the stage, so to speak, with a blessing and music. And then I will ask you all just to come to this step, and then one at a time come up and be received. I'm going to offer a blessing personally, and then Catherine and Judith will offer you some gifts. When you finish with Judith here, you can come to this microphone and just say your name and where you're originally from. So it might just be Jonathan Ellerby, Winnipeg, Canada. You don't have to do anything else. Are we all together? And everyone who's watching, well, you get to do your job, and you get to focus on your practice, which is remembering what it means to hold others in your heart, whether you know them or not. So let's begin. You can start making your way to the front. And I'll be there in a moment to greet you. Dear God, divine light, today we remember together what it means to be many as one. Today we ask special blessings on each person who has made a declaration of love to this community, the Althea Center, to spirit, to their own souls unfolding, and to being peacemakers and healers in this world. May each be blessed and guided each and every moment from this day on. Amen.